Hello, everyone. I wanted to do a book review of a book that I've used the last couple semesters in my college class, in my U.S. history class. One of the books that I have my students read, and I was really glad that I had them read this book, particularly in the spring when we had to move from face to face to online in a dramatic fashion within a matter of days. I had my students read and do a book review of this book called March. This is volume 3. There's 3 volumes. I had my students do the 3rd volume here. This book is a National Book Award winner. It is written jointly by John Lewis and one of his staffers before John Lewis died. One of his staffers, Andrew Iden, was contributing to this book. And then the artwork is done by Nate Powell. If you're interested in using this book in a class, or even if you are someone who wants to learn more about the civil rights movement, I highly recommend any of the volumes, but my favorite one is volume 3. But any of the volumes of March by John Lewis. You will learn quickly and efficiently and in a powerful way some of the ideas of the civil rights movement and what people in the 1960s, what some people in the 1960s had to endure. A couple of things about this book that is very interesting, at least that I find interesting, is it is not technically a history book. Some might say it's not a history book. It's a graphic novel. And the beauty of this book is that it's done in black and white. I think this medium is very interesting for reaching maybe a new generation of people who maybe are not all that interested in reading a traditional history book. I love this page here. John Lewis is getting on an airplane and he's heading back to regroup, and you can see it's just white with a plane and in the background and a few sort of words. I think it's a really clever way to sort of communicate visually as well as textually. The other image here that I thought I'd illustrate is how they use black in the background. So here is a shooting of Jamie Lee Jackson, a 26-year-old Army veteran who was shot in the middle of the night. And you might think that this it would be much more, I guess, violent in color. Is still violent here in black and white, but you can sort of get just an image here of some of the artwork that's being done here and the powerful messages that are being communicated just using black and white. I think this is really a clever idea to do this. John Lewis, of course, is a young man when the 60s civil rights movement kicks off. And I think we should be careful to distinguish the 60s version of the civil rights versus a civil rights movement that has always existed in reality. Even if we go back to the days of slavery, we can imagine a sustained civil rights movement that was orchestrated by runaway slaves on the one hand, but also people like Frederick Douglass, who escaped and began to advocate for more of an end to slavery and even equality after the Civil War. And then we can move forward into the sort of end of the 19th century when you have people like Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois and many others, Marcus Garvey and many others we can sort of point to that are sustaining this civil rights movement, albeit sort of broken and fractured in many ways. And so then when we get to the 1960s, the mid 50s and 1960s is what many people would sort of recognize as the civil rights movement. Officially, it's more of a of a sort of more recent manifestation of a movement that has already laid a lot of groundwork down. When Lewis is, I think, 19 or so, he throws himself into the civil rights movement. And although there is a lot of ground to cover that he and many other people, from Martin Luther King Jr. to Stokely Carmichael to many, many, many other people are going to sort of have to traverse, a lot of that groundwork had already been laid in some ways, not only by people like Rosa Parks, but by people like Du Bois and Washington, and going back even further. So this is a long sustained movement in a lot of ways. A lot of the stuff that they did that so many of us admired, we never really experienced ourselves, and were never really able to engage in and on a personal level. And so what Lewis has, I think, tried to do over much of his later career as a politician is that he has not only tried to keep the civil rights movement going, but trying to speak to a younger generation, and how to keep this movement alive and going and reach a new generation. He has really something really imaginative here. You can read this book in middle school, I think. You can read this in high school, and you certainly can read this in your college class to get an understanding of what the civil rights movement was. And it just speaks to, in a powerful way, using black and white imagery. The visual imagery speaks loudly, even in some ways more loudly than the text, the words that are used here. And this is kind of what makes, I think, this book so interesting and fascinating to use. Here, what Lewis does is he sort of lays out a manual of what they did, and what they had to overcome, and how people treated them, not just in violent ways, but sometimes in less violent, but just as humiliating ways. For example, they were in a line to vote, and the sheriff and his deputies basically came out to say, if anybody steps out of this line, you're not going to be able to vote. And they slowed the line down on purpose and made them stand all day, and they didn't have any food and water, and then people tried to bring water to the people in line to vote. And if anybody tried to help give the person in line water to drink, the sheriff's deputy would arrest them on the spot. These sorts of things. Many of my students in their book reviews, and I didn't prompt them or anything to sort of say this, I thought this was really interesting. Many of them said that this was essential reading, that everybody should read this book. It was mind-blowing. They said that their understanding of the civil rights movement had changed dramatically because they had read this book. I began to sort of use this book as a way to introduce other people to history as well. Sometimes I run across people on the street or wherever, they find out I'm a historian, and they want to say things like, oh, I know all about history, and sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes people are interested in history, but sometimes they just can't really be motivated to read a thick sort of history book. So I recommend this series, and every person so far I've recommended this has bought the book, at least one volume of March, and they've read it and they've loved it. They have thought it was fascinating. It's a quick read because of all the visual imagery that is included, but it also really potently brings the message home of exactly what life was like for many Americans in the 1960s. Now, from a history perspective, this book allows us to make or ask some very fascinating questions, I think. Because although he really goes basically from the civil rights, from the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing up to the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the other volumes cover earlier ground. This is graphic. It's a comic book. Is it possible to have a graphic history? Is one question that we can ask our students to think about. On the one hand, this is a primary source. These are actually John Lewis's recollections. But on the other hand, the artwork, the visual representation is clearly not only in black and white. John Lewis experienced these things in color. This is me experiencing these things in black and white, and it's a visual representation. So there is got to be some sort of drama added to some of these things that we might ask, is that accurate? Is it inaccurate? The artist, in this case, Nate Powell, who is interpreting Lewis's memories and interpreting Lewis's words to write or to create an image that may or may not be the most accurate. Is that the purpose of this book, to be accurate historically? Or is it more important to communicate a feeling or an idea rather than necessarily to document exactly what's going on? Can graphic histories do what maybe a photojournalist's sort of work can do? That's one question we can ask. We can also ask whether this is a credible and a reliable source or not, right? Because on the one hand, Lewis is writing this at the end of his at the end of his life, and he is also describing sort of things from the past, from many years ago. His memory is there now. He would have newspapers, and maybe he wrote journals, or he obviously would have read other people's experiences that he can draw on to sort of corroborate his own memory. But here we can ask how credible and reliable a graphic history can be. Is it credible? Is it reliable? And this leads us maybe to another question that we can ask about this book. What is the purpose of this book? What is Lewis trying to do here? Is he trying to write a history here? Or does he have another purpose? Is his purpose to maybe be more of a motivation for young people and to also commemorate those who have died along the way? A couple of interesting little clues here that we might sort of think about in this book. He dedicates it to the past and future children of the movement. So that might suggest that maybe this is less a history and maybe more of a work designed to keep the movement alive and going. He clearly has an idea here about how he's trying to reach new people, people who maybe are not interested in reading a full-on history of the civil rights movement, but people who need a very succinct, easier way to connect to some of the ideas that the civil rights movement is creating. And for that reason, I think that this book is genius. It is absolutely an amazing work. And Lewis, I think, and his collaborators here who have created this book have done something that is innovative and creative. So buy a copy if you're interested, and if you have any sort of thoughts or feedback about the book, leave a comment below, and I'll respond, and see you next time.